Hello, welcome to Books Up Close, the podcast. I'm Chris Lloyd. This is the close reading show for writers, readers, and anyone interested in language. In today's episode, I talk to Sara Ahmed about a passage from her book, No is Not a Lonely Utterance, The Art and Activism of Complaining. Sara is an independent queer feminist scholar of colour. Her work is concerned with how power is experienced and challenged in everyday life and institutional cultures. Welcome, Sara. Nice to see you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Chris. I'm really pleased to be here.
Of course, you know how much of a fan I am of you and your work and how much it reverberates in my brain at all times. So it's really good to have you here to talk through this new book, No is Not a Lonely Utterance, which is really exciting. And we're going to read a passage from near the end in a moment and talk about that. But before we go there, the question I ask everyone is, how do you feel about close reading as practice, as art?
Oh, I mean, it's a good question. You know, when I hear the words close reading, I do still think back to my own training as a literature student, learning how to close read, how to think about poetry and language, what to pay attention to. In fact, I was thinking about this the other day that in my modernism literature course, one of the comments on my essay was, has a tendency to see significance everywhere. So I think there was always something about my relationship to close reading. It was always almost like hyper closeness to the text I was engaged with. But when I think about close reading, I think the word that really matters to me is the close. And I think of close reading in relationship to close writing, close listening. It's like proximity as a kind of relationship that takes work and that involves labor. Because in a way, there's a lot that's quite close to us that we don't notice, that we don't attend to because we're used to it. It's just there. So I also think about closeness as a way of actually learning to notice what is around us and to pick up significance that we might have missed because it is so familiar. One of the reasons I wrote a lot about tables was for that reason, that the tables are mentioned as examples in philosophy, but you're not supposed to look at them because they're not the point. But when you begin to actually notice the table, this object that's meant only to illustrate, then the table has its own life and you can follow a journey. So for me, close reading is about the labor of noticing what is already there and then having a journey by thinking about what is there, each bit that's assembled as having its own life, as taking you places.
I mean, for you, do you think we don't notice enough just because of habituation, or do you think we're trained not to notice for particular reasons?
I think both. I mean, I think they both matter. I think there's a way in which becoming familiar or becoming used to something, that kind of sense of habituation can mean just becoming comfortable or relaxed, and not seeing something can just be a sign of being at home somewhere. And it might be that you really notice that the vase on the mantelpiece isn't there because it's usually there. So you notice the vase when it's missing. So there's a way in which when things are as you expect them to be, you pass over them. But I think there are certain parts of our social landscape that we're taught not to notice, that we're taught not to see as young people, perhaps the homeless person that's always there just at the beginning of the street. You're taught to hurry past what is seen to get in the way of how you occupy space. So the hurrying past, like who or what are we taught to hurry past, and what would it mean to slow down and to actually pay attention? And how would that change then our relationship to the space that we're in, or the text that we're reading, or the world that we're being accommodated by? So I do think, you know, there is something about close reading that is about time and taking time. And, you know, habits are useful because they speed things up. You don't have to think about something when it's a habit. It allows you to think about other things. So in some ways, being pulled out of our habits, ordinary ways of being comfortable or relaxed, is quite important to the ethics of being in a world or a text a little differently.
Yeah, close reading, you know, it's such a spatial metaphor, but the temporal dimension as well that you're kind of paying attention to is really useful. And some of that comes up in the extract we can look at today. And this is near the end of the book. It starts on page 305 for listeners that want to read along, if you haven't bought it, go buy it. What are you doing with yourselves? Go buy the book.
Please do.
Yeah, please definitely do. And then go buy The Feminist Killjoy Handbook and all the other books, because there are so many. Would you be able to read the passage for us first, Sarah, and then we can jump into it?
Yes, I'd be pleased to. Remember again the bird's lesson. Disrupting usage and creating a shelter can refer to the same action. We create spaces so we can find each other, openings, however small, where we can assemble without being displaced by the letters in the box or displaced too quickly. I added displaced too quickly, as spaces created by self-assembly are always precarious. To assemble, to say no, to do no, throws so much open. We throw ourselves into projects that are urgent and necessary, doing what we can, when we can, however we can, in the wear and the tear, for as long as it takes. This is not just about doing what we can to survive ourselves. It is doing what we can so others can survive. Survival can be a promise. To quote from Black feminist poet Alexis Pauline Gumbs, quoting Black feminist poet Audre Lorde, one we make to each other. And so we address each other. Little ghosts, little birds, a complaint graveyard, a queer nest. To make a nest possible, to make it possible to nest, we have to stop what usually happening, more letters being posted, piling up, taking up space. So many of our efforts, our complaints, our protests also end up buried in the same pile, leaving us with less air. We have to fight, then, to breathe, creating pockets within institutions or outside of them, so we can keep doing the work, using whatever we have handy. We end up with so many materials. What a mess. Yes, that mess can be a picture of our complaints, a picture of our lives. That mess can also be a queer map telling us where we have been, our comings and goings.
Thank you so much. Lovely to hear you read that. And you really get a sense, I think, as you're reading, of the way you're so interested in language in all of your books, right? Even when you're communicating something else, like you're paying attention to the rhythm of the line, the pacing, the way language or words repeat. One of the things I think about your work so often is that like you pick up a word and then you're like, let me just look at it in a few different ways, right? And maybe that's the habituation thing we were talking about earlier, right? Like we're so used to using a word in a particular way that you kind of forget all of these other kind of inferences or the kind of textures that have accrued to it over time. And I think this is a really good example of how you do this. Displaced, assemble, address, these words that you come back to and kind of rethink. I guess maybe that's part of your literary training, as you said, but you know, is that how you would describe your kind of orientation to like how you think about the world, that you're trying to look at it in different angles or kind of in different light?
Yeah. I guess I think about words as materials, as object-like. And if you put an object in a certain position, you see it from a certain perspective, you get so much. You move it around, you get something else. So that kind of sense of moving something around to capture different significance, that's certainly part of what I think of as a practice of the work itself. And, you know, when I wrote about What's the Use, my book on the uses of use, you know, playing with the word use, I guess, slightly annoying to some people, no doubt, but playing with words is something that just intrigues me. But one of the ideas is that, you know, to queer use is to use something in a way that was not intended. It was not intended for that use or that person. And I think with words too, that there are ways in which words have a typical arrangement, how we know them. They get used in a very particular way. They get organized into sentences and paragraphs, into chunks of meaning where they get settled. And part of like a kind of queer, kind of close proximity to language for me is about not just that different words have many meanings, but that you can sort of throw a word open by thinking about unintended meanings or meanings that are not ordinarily understood to be in a word, to reside in a word, or to be near a word. You can bring out it's got a queer potential. And a lot of words, in a way, once a word has caught my attention, then I used to describe it as following it around. And some of the words that first caught my attention are words that would have been used against me. Like, in a way, the word killjoy was a word that is a stereotype about feminists. So it's miserable feminists who make misery their mission. And, it's a word that's been thrown at us to dismiss the kind of politics we have or the point of view we articulate. And then you kind of like, you take that word and you use it to give another angle on that history. And you begin to say, well, actually, if questioning sexism or homophobia or transphobia makes you unhappy, kills your joy, then so be it. And so you accept the history of how that word has been used, but you don't allow that acceptance to delimit possibility. You allow the kind of history of that word, the way it's been used as a tool to make certain people seem smaller or strange or unacceptable. You actually rework that history and you turn it around so that the no that has been expressed toward you, you redirect to the institution. You redirect towards those who use that word against you. So that kind of like opening up of the potential of a word to signify anew has a real political point to it. It's not just about, oh, let's play with different words and see what they mean. It's partly about recognizing how words get used to delimit and to contain, and then trying to unleash the potential for them to mean something else is also about freeing ourselves from those containers.
I love the way you put that, because for me this whole podcast project is about trying to show what happens in a literature classroom to people outside it, right? Like the kinds of things we get up to with texts, but also like the possibilities of things you could do with texts, and then the world as text, right? That language isn't just neutral, arbitrary. It's not just like natural in the world. Like we've decided how it works, and I think one of the things in this passage that stands out to me is kind of picking up a word and seeing it in maybe like two ways. So remembering again the bird's lesson, disrupting usage and creating a shelter can refer to the same action. So you've got kind of like these two different ways of describing the same thing, but disrupting usage and creating a shelter, people might see that they're radically different things, right?
Yeah.
But we create spaces so we can find each other, openings, however small, where we can assemble without being displaced by the letters in the box or displaced too quickly. You're kind of circling around these kind of words to kind of like prise open the kind of possibilities that they could refer to. And the bird's lesson, I guess, is the mailbox story in this book, and that you picked up in other books as well.
Yeah, I mean that actually the birds that turn the postbox into a nest are one of the primary examples I use of queer use. So I saw it. I saw an image that said, "Please do not use the box," because the birds are turning the postbox into a nest. So please don't use the box is assigned to would-be posters of letters, not to use a box because that's now become a nest from the point of view of the birds. That's what the box is for. So the birds have turned a small opening intended for the letters into a door, a queer door, I would say, a way of getting in and out of the box. So I began to think of those birds that turn a postbox into a nest as our queer kin. They are creating room for themselves, space for themselves, in what would otherwise be a hostile environment. Because, of course, if you kept posting the letters, the birds would be displaced. So I kind of like, I first used that image of the postbox that's become a nest in my book, What's the Use? But it really, for me, helped me to rethink what I call diversity work, the work we have to do because we're not accommodated by institutions, or the work we have to do to make institutions more accommodating. So the birds, when I think about the bird's lesson, I'm actually being quite literal here, that the birds help me to see something about that labor. Like when you think about the ways in which sometimes institutions, you can enter a room or a building and just feel a wall that says to you, you're not meant to be here. You don't belong here. This is not for you. And that wall that tells you this is not for you won't be visible, tangible, or perceptible to those for whom the institution is accommodating. And so there was something about the birds, the queer use that they put the postbox to. It's a kind of happy story, a happy image But actually, to queer use usually requires doing more than just turning up. Usually we have to work quite hard. And so when I was doing the research on complaint, talking to people who had made complaints about ableism, sexism, racism, harassment, bullying, transphobia, the common thread was a complaint, not the thing the complaint was about. Although almost all the people I spoke to were complaining about discrimination or harassment or exclusion of one form or another. But when I was doing this research, one person, her pseudonym is Viola in the book, used this description of a complaint. She said, it was like a little bird scratching away at something, which is such an evocative image. You have a real sense of how you can feel quite small. In fact, she repeated the word small in her testimony, small, small, small. She felt really small. She was neurodivergent, trying to get the time that she needed to do her work. She did not get the time she needed to do her work. In fact, her complaint just took up more time that she didn't have, time that she needed. And she shared this image and it really spoke to me. And I could almost hear the scratching, the sound, the little bird scratching away at something. And of course, immediately having already written about the birds turning postbox into a nest, my little ears pricked up when she evoked that image. And so I heard something in it because I'd already been writing about the birds and the way in which they created a space for themselves. It made me really understand something about the labor, how it can feel like scratching away, trying to create room for yourself. And so I'm picking up in this passage that appears towards the end of the book. I'm picking up this layering of birds, these many different birds. And I can hear, when I read out that passage just now to you, Chris, I could hear Viola saying it to me. And that's when I think about closeness, is closeness in listening, in hearing. Significance is partly about hearing the voices of others and how like one image can be evocative of another image. And they're not just two separate images brought together by some quirky, idiosyncratic person. The images have something to do with each other. They're telling us something about each other. And there's something very dialogic, very much about a dialogue across time and space. And that's what, to me, the joy of research is, when you begin to hear the sound of different images and voices and people. They collect and they gather and they become an assembly, to use another of the words in the passage.
Yeah, it's like, you said you used to describe it as following words around, right? As the words that are kind of like outside of us, but at the same time, you kind of accumulate words, right? In this book, but also if you've read the trajectory of your work, as I have, you also hear the accumulation across the books, right? That, you started this thought or this image came up in this book, and now it's here. When it's layered with this other image or this other word, it suddenly takes on a new kind of vibrancy and a new kind of like impetus. And that's also a part of the close practice of listening, of reading, of noticing that actually that image has a lot to do with that image over there.
Yeah.
And what I'm interested in is how you don't just describe that in this book, but you kind of formalize it on the page, right? That's what I mean by the kind of like the repetitions or the kind of the turnings around of like sentences that you really do need to formalize that for us. It's not just a thing you're seeing, but like it's enacting it in the language. Displaced by the letters in the box or displaced too quickly. I added displaced too quickly, as spaces created by self-assembly are always precarious. To assemble, to say no, to do no, throw so much open. We throw ourselves into projects. There's so much like accumulation of sound and image and language there, but you're doing it aloud, right? Like I added displaced too quickly as spaces created. Not many authors would like tell us what they're doing in the writing.
Yes. No, I like to sort of like almost, I think of it as leaving the trail behind so it can be followed. And, I think those two sentences also, when I read them, I can remember giving them as a spoken lecture. I gave a lecture called Changing Institutions on Common Sense and Complaint as institutional legacies at Oxford University, just after the students had set up a Palestinian encampment. And as we know, a lot of institutions have used force to try and stop students from protesting and pointing to their complicity in genocide. And but when I gave this lecture, it actually really changed things for me, which is interesting because I was talking about change, because you know I've been very reluctant to share my research on complaint in universities, in institutions, really, partly because often the institutions are enacting the very forms of violence I'm describing. And I also got a sense that in being invited into institutions, it was almost like they're giving you the nod, as if they're saying yes to the critique of what they're doing, but that doesn't stop them doing it. And then I can feel like I'm wrapped up in all sorts of complicities that I don't even necessarily know about. But when I gave this lecture, and I partly gave it because of who invited me, which was a group of students, gender studies students, they invited me. They were the ones who wanted me to speak to them because of some of the experiences they'd had, in fact, at the institution I was speaking at. And because it had just after they had pulled together the Palestinian encampment, what I found was that the atmosphere of that encampment had leaked into the lecture theatre. And it was totally different. It was like being in a different space. It was electric. People were loud. There was sound. There was noise. And it was just like, because lecture theatres are so organised to remind us of hierarchy and history, the way they're organised. But it felt like I was in a different kind of space. And I thought a lot about that. Those sentences are about, the spaces that we create, however small and opening. It's the encampment. Yes, it's the work of assembling together to say no to institutional violence. But the opening is also how that energy leaked into other spaces and how it was transformative of what those spaces were doing and what we were doing in them. And so even though you will be often displaced if you do the work of occupying buildings and that has been a long history of occupation as a tactic by students, especially within universities, that before they displace you by whatever means, often through using the law, there are things that you will do. There is activities that you'll be engaged in. And that space is an opening, is an invitation to think a little bit, to act in another way, and to think about how education can be different when we're actually throwing open what it means or what we are doing when we are assembling. So that sentence is sort of, for me, was very much about what it was like to be reminded that the openings that we create by saying no to institutional violence, they can be how political energy travels. And that's a potentially very transformative action. It doesn't necessarily mean, the birds, might be displaced and things might go back to quote unquote business as usual. But in that moment of suspension, other things happened.
Yeah, and that I kind of love the phrasing of to say no, to do no, throw so much open. And again, like throw so much open, there's a kind of like a passivity, not a passivity, but like the throwing is being done just by virtue of the no, which could be a literal I'm saying no, or it could just be the refusal, right? That no has these different resonances of what like no, of what rejection, negation could mean. I think that's a really interesting phrase that you pick up through this book. Like no is not only utterance; it's both an utterance as well as an act.
Yeah, I italicize no in each instance of its use, pretty much each instance. And the book didn't begin with that title. It was originally called A Complainer's Handbook, following on from the Feminist Killjoy Handbook. But my editor, Josephine Graywood, thought she wanted a title that was less prosaic and more poetic. And also the other issue for me was, the way in which complaint and complaining, it can be a hegemonic practice. It's just thinking of Karen, the white woman who complains and her complaint gets uptake because she's socially valued, because spaces are presumed to be for her. Did I want to give Karen a handbook? No, I didn't want to give Karen a handbook. So I was actually okay with the change of title, even though when I think of handbook, that word for me, I think of hand, being given a hand or a helping hand or an outstretched hand. The kind of hand that we need is one that helps pull us out of a difficult situation. But I was still quite happy for it to be no, it's not a lonely utterance. And it helped me to pick up the significance of no throughout, which, no can be a relatively simple utterance, yes or no, an answer to a question. But if you're working within a hierarchical institution, whether it's a university or another kind of institution, saying no can be really, really complicated because it can mean that you lose access to resources. So many people don't say no because they fear the consequences. And the book is partly about that, all the reasons they can build up like piles of letters in a box, all the reasons you're told that saying no will deprive you of what you need to get on or to move on. And yet people have said no. People have complained. And they often do so not because they feel that they can change the conditions in which they're working, but because they don't want other people to inherit those conditions. So there's something about that no, which is a kind of a hopeful utterance about the possibility of things being otherwise, that it takes saying no to, let's say, harassment or bullying for harassment and bullying no longer to be just the way things are. So I partly wanted to sort of talk about kind of the social and institutional life of a no, and the way in which it can have lives that we don't even know about. So a lot of the book is also about the way in which a no, it might feel like you didn't get anywhere, or you didn't get anywhere. You might even leave the institution because you didn't get anywhere, but you just don't know who will pick that no up, or how that no will become a resource for other people. So there's quite a few stories in the book about how, somebody made a complaint and then they found out from other people or through strange means sometimes about earlier complaints. Like one, Esther made a complaint about disability discrimination, had one of those meetings where you feel the walls coming down. And then suddenly this file appeared in the Students' Union, and it was all of these historical documents about students who'd made that complaint before, and it helped Esther to realise she wasn't on her own. She wasn't the first person to make that complaint, she wasn't the only person to make that complaint. She had companions. And so No is Not a Lonely Utterance is also about the companionship of no and how we can find others who say it. But yes, saying it and doing it. And there's a way in which the book is also about all the ways that institutions say things or appear to be committed to equality and diversity and yet don't act in a way that is consistent with those forms of appearance. So saying something can sometimes be quite empty. Institutions can say yes because there's nothing behind that yes to bring it about. And then, interestingly, no becomes more than words. It requires action. It requires perhaps the withdrawal of your labour or refusal to participate in something. There's all different ways in which a no can be expressed, because I think one of the other things I really wanted to convey with the word complaint itself is that, we tend to think about it in terms of bureaucracy and formal complaint processes, but that's just one meaning. A complaint can also be a bodily symptom, like a lump in your throat or a pain in your neck. It can be all the different ways you express dissatisfaction with a situation. And so the range and the kind of like sort of capaciousness of complaint is also something that I'm attending to.
And like the gathering that you were just describing, and also the kind of gathering of meanings of words too, of people, of words, of action, you again kind of formalize that on the page in Survival Can Be a Promise, to quote Black feminist poet Alexis Pauline Gumbs, quoting Black feminist poet Audre Lorde. And so we address each other, right? There's that you are doing the citational practice in the sentence too, right? You could easily have just given us a footnote, right? Or just, said where Gumbs says this, but you are describing the kind of the history of an idea, like where that's cropped up in thinkers that you're interested in, that you're kind of reading, and how one has influenced another that's influenced another, right? So that Survival Can Be a Promise is you and this kind of complaint circle with these other thinkers as well. And I think formalizing that in the sentence is quite powerful. I don't think I'd thought about it in that way until I read that sentence. That, we know something is like you put it at the bottom of the page, or, in the end notes. Some people might look at and some people might not, but you're kind of like, this is a trajectory, a history, a lineage that I'm telling you is important to this work.
Yeah. And, I really love how Alexis Pauline Gumbs has gathered the work of Audre Lorde and brought it to life for new readers in her book with the title Survival Can Be a Promise. And that quote from Lorde that Gumbs really picks up and really explores the significance of that sentence, which I think from memory is a sentence that was actually cut from the final text, the Lorde text. And yeah, I love there's a line in Living a Feminist Life, which, is actually quite an old book now. It's 2017. Citation is feminist memory. And here we might say citation is Black feminist memory. So sort of thinking about citation is not just about recognizing debt or how you acquired an idea, but citation is a way of keeping a trail alive, like keeping a connection alive. And there is a poetics to that, I think. There is a kind of like each name, I'm kind of like Black feminist poet, repeating that. There's something about the beauty, I think, of how Gums has it helps keep Lord alive, and how Lord helps keep us alive. Like this kind of like survival for Lord is she says it in her poem, A Litany for Survival. Some of us were not meant to survive, and she evokes these coming and going. You might hear an echo there from Lord's poem, A Litany for Survival, where she talks about those who come and who come and go in the. I don't know if it's the exact language actually, but who are coming and going in the doorways, in the hours between dawns. So it sort of almost evokes a way in which, for many, like survival isn't about coming into the full light of day. It might even be that the shadows where you are not quite seen, the hours between dawn, like there's a kind of a queer sense there that being undetected or not quite being seen also is what might keep certain people alive, because actually to come out, to be visible, to be seen, is to be at risk or to be endangered. And so there's
Yeah.
a kind of like, these are the fainter traces and the fainter trails, the almost not quite heard, not quite remembered, that in that kind of like faintness is also a possibility, another kind of inheritance. So there's something that I'm trying to pick up there about Lord's work as a kind of archive that draws our attention to kind of like the fight to survive and what we might need, and how that might require not following the paths that we are told will make us safe or will make us happy. Finding our
Yeah.
own paths, our own trails. I call them desire lines. Well, I didn't invent that term. I use the term desire lines in my book, Queer Phenomenology, which is a word from landscape architecture, the lines in the ground where people are not following the official routes. These alternative trails, alternative routes. They might be fainter, but they're also more direct. And they also could be where we find each other. So that picks up a little bit on this idea of finding each other in these paths, in these sort of messy places.
Side point, but I think of that every time I go off a trail. Whenever I go off a trail, I think of that book and I'm like, oh, but we're like remaking this path and going the route that's like quickest, but isn't for me. I'm like, should we go that way? I'm like, no, we should go that way. Like, it's always in my brain. And there's a turn then in that next paragraph, right? And so, comma, we address each other. There's a kind of sense of like, when you're talking in this book, like there are different kinds of registers. Sometimes you're talking like to particular people or in particular contexts. And there's this moment where it kind of like almost expands almost, right? You're kind of like pulling us in to that address. Little ghosts, little birds, a complaint graveyard, a queer nest, which are all kind of the images that you're describing that you've picked up through the book, right? That you're gathering along the way. To make a nest possible, to make it possible to nest, we have to stop what usually happens happening. You feel this kind of gathering of the book. The book seems to be gathering in the way that you're describing and kind of drawing these lines of connection and disconnection as well. I just think it's a really interesting kind of linguistic turn that, and so we address each other. There's this that we're part of this book now.
Oh, I'm glad. I'm glad to hear that, because I want to think of the person who is reading this book as somebody who might themselves have had a hard time because of complaints you've made, because
Yep.
you've encountered the very thing you're complaining about when you complain, because you don't feel that you've been given room to do the work you need to do or to be the person that you are. Like, I know that the material is really hard and heavy. So it was really important to me when I think of the person who is reading, the listener or the reader, as someone who has to take care of themselves to enter this space, has to look after themselves, because it's hard sometimes to be in proximity to what makes it hard. And so we address each other is also sort of picking up one of the arguments from the chapter before, which is on complaints as activism, which is that, when you follow a formal complaint process, you are, as it were, having to use the institution's language. And the students that I work with, when I was involved in a complaint process at my former employer, the students that I supported write about this. Lila Whitley, Tiffany Page, Alice Corbell, and others write about how, in order to get their complaint through, it had to not sound like them. And there's a way in which I was trying to differentiate then between the complaints that we make and those that we have. And to say that, in a way, it can feel like when you're directed to make a formal complaint, you are directed not just to use the institution's language, but to enter into a process that's designed to keep the institution safe and to protect those who are already valued by the institution. One of the arguments in the chapter on activism is that a lot of the activism around complaint is changing the addressee. So you're no longer going through a complaint process, or maybe not just going through a complaint process in which you're required to address the institution. So the institution that might be the object of your complaint is also its recipient. But actually instead you address the complaint to each other. So I use examples where people write each other postcards or letters, or turn complaints into songs, or perform complaints, and thinking about each other as being the person who receives the no, so that we then do become an assembly. So that kind of like the address to actually, in the sense of the person we're addressing the letter to, or the institution we're addressing the letter to, or whoever we're addressing the letter to. I'm trying to pick up in that. And so we address each other, that kind of shift. The addressee is each other. Following on from Lord and Gums, it's important that and so we address each other follows on, because I'm sort of also recognizing it's an ode to those who've come before us, who've made it possible for us to be here, to do this work. So addressing each other is also addressing those of us, those who made the work possible, those who are behind us. There's a lot going on in that sentence, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we have to stop what usually happens happening. I feel like, is a key thread of like so many of your books, right? That like what usually happens keeps happening because it keeps happening, right? Like this kind of this circle of that logic that as long as things continue the way they are, they will continue the way
Yeah.
they are. And it's the interruption of that. It's the kind of the rejection of, again, that it's a different kind of habituation, right? Of that things just stay static in the way because everyone's like, well, that's how it's always been. And to question it would seem to be like odd or problematic, or, why would you want to stop things from happening as
Yeah.
they always have? And I think that interruption is like one of the key insights of like your work. But I just love the sentence, what usually happens happening, which,
Yeah.
kind of sounds grammatically kind of weird, but it does the work of showing you that actually that needs interrupting.
Yeah.
If that makes
Yeah. No, that expresses exactly what I intended. What usually happening, and thinking about the birds as our teachers again. What's important there is that if the post box was still used in the way that it was intended, the birds would be displaced. There's no action necessary to displace the birds other than doing what you usually do. The displacement is a consequence of how the post box would be occupied. That's all it takes to do what you usually do. And that is actually what we could say about a lot of institutional politics and how institutions get reproduced. They don't have to deliberately exclude some people. They just have to select people in the way that they usually select people, because they define excellence or merit or quality or what they want around who is already here. They don't have to target anybody to make some people the object of suspicion. They just have to organize the institution in the way it has already been done. And I think that's actually quite important. It's still work to reproduce the institution as it gets reproduced, but it's not a kind of, as it were, quote unquote, additional work. And that's also important, because when I'm sort of talking about the politics of this, the work of I'm doing on complaint, what I'm not trying to say is that there's a problem with how institutions handle complaints, although I am saying that. But that's not really the point. The problem that I'm getting at is actually not something that's going to be resolved by having better complaints procedures or new policies. It's something to do with the reproductive mechanisms themselves, like how institutions get understood as being for certain people, and which people are understood as therefore stronger or more valuable, or a word that appears throughout the book, more important. because in fact one of the people in my book, Andrew, is a pseudonym. When she was considering making a complaint about harassment and bullying, she was told, be careful, he's an important man.
Mm.
Important. She was being told not to do that, not to go there, because he could do that. He could stop her. He would stop her. In the warning not to complain is also a threat. So we're really, coming up against decisions that have already been made about who is more important. And you're being told perhaps that if you were to complain about somebody who isn't important, that you are not important, and that to complain would then shut the door on your own career. And that's the sort of function of many of these warnings. I think it's worth pointing out before, like I say, to make a nest possible. So I'm sort of evoking again the little birds that they're doing a lot of work on my behalf. Thank you, birds. That also the other is little ghosts. And, Viola used the image of the little bird scratching away at something. And another person who I communicated with in writing shared the image of her complaint going to a complaint graveyard. And, I think she was sort of evoking in a way the filing cabinet. So the filing cabinet, that grey, silvery piece of furniture that we're familiar with, becomes the place that complaints go to die. And I remember sharing this image of the complaint graveyard with Anne, who appears, that's a pseudonym, appears throughout the book. And she made a complaint about bullying that was actually a collective complaint and had to leave. And I mentioned the complaint graveyard to her, and she said something like, oh, they want us to be these little ghosts, little lonely ghosts on our own, but we need to be in common graveyards. We need the graveyard to be bigger. So when you think of the image of a complaint, a no, ending up in the complaint graveyard, going there to die, it is an image perhaps of the end, of death, of there being no possibility of nesting, of life, of new life. But she was sort of implying that, the more no's you are, the more no's that end up in this place, this burial ground, the more you are, the more life there is. And in a way, the complaint graveyard, the little bird, I began to hear the connection between the little bird and the little ghost. And this sort of quite deadly image with this quite life-creating image, nesting, dying, together, complaint graveyard, a queer nest. So that again is partly about like having the voices of these different people I spoke to and the different images becoming echoes of each other and building up to create this collective really, a collective not as it's traditionally understood, a group of people coming together to act in concert, but a kind of a pile of different hopes and aspirations and refusals, all somehow finding themselves up in a similar place so that they can be heard together, so that they can create something from what appears to be just meeting walls and doors that stop you. And there's something very affirming, I think, in hearing the ghost and the bird together.
Yeah, and bringing them into their own kind of dialogue, right? Because again, that's a different kind of hearing that, you could easily, I've read books where like each chapter might have like an image, right, that it coalesces around, and then you move on to the next one. But I think you're telling something about like, now that I've heard that image, right, now that I have that figure, that's now coming with me and us, right, on the journey. That suddenly shines light on this other image that I'm going to show you. That to me is the kind of the paying attention, that none of these things are in isolation. I think that's quite a beautiful like formalization of what you're also talking about ethically as well, right? And you end in that little bit, in the bit that we've quoted, we end up with so many materials. What a mess. Which I love is just like that little sentence. It's just so colloquial, right? Like what a mess.
Yeah, what a mess.
Yes, that mess can be a picture of our complaints, a picture of our lives. That mess can also be a queer map telling us where we have been, our comings and goings. And like a little bit below that on the page, you have like a drawing, right, of this squiggle, this map that you describe as a queer map. And I think it's also worth saying that you often do have like images in your books too, right? You like these aren't just like kind of literary figurations, but you also like show them to us too. And I think that's it's really interesting just to have that kind of like squiggly map at the bottom of that page as both, as you say, like a kind of description of something, but also like a way of visualizing possibility, right? That map is it's queer, it's different, it's where we've been, our comings and goings. Like it's not linear, right? It's not straightforward, it's not teleological. I just think it's interesting to change what a mess to like what a mess. Like that is the nature of our lives, right? That is the nature of our work, and that's something to kind of hold on to.
Yeah. there's definitely sort of seeing in mess a kind of like possibility, like all of those lines, who knows where you will end up. But thinking about kind of the visual images, I remember exactly when I began to use images in that way, and it was interestingly when I was doing the diversity research. So I am literary trained, but I ended up doing social science projects, one on diversity, and then the one that this book is informed by more the one on complaint. And when I was doing the project on diversity, I was basically talking to diversity practitioners about how they use the word diversity. So it began as a following the word diversity around project, but it kind of changed everything because I was talking to practitioners who had been appointed by institutions to, institutionalize their commitment to diversity, but who would often describe the institution as a wall. So one practitioner said, it's a banging your head against the brick wall job. So when the wall keeps its place, it's you that gets sore. And so one time I was trying to sort of think about, what it felt like to do diversity work, to keep coming up against the walls that don't appear unless you're trying to change the institution, because it might look like the institution is as happy as its diversity policy, as open and happy as its diversity policy. So you're coming up against something, you're being stopped by the very institution that has appointed you to change it. Like there's something about that labor, what it feels like, that I really wanted to capture. And I don't know exactly how this happened, but I was doing my PowerPoint and I just went to Google Images and picked out a picture of a brick wall and put it on the PowerPoint and then put above it a job description. And I remember sharing this PowerPoint and sharing that image, and the reaction of the audience was just like, yeah. There's something about seeing that wall and then with the caption job description that really captured it in a way that I probably wouldn't have been able to convey if I was representing it to the audience through words. So, and then when I did the project on uses of use, I began to expand the range of different walls. So the scratched wall appears, and the way in which the scratching on the wall then became testimony or writing on the wall, and different images of use. I mentioned the birds using the postbox as a nest, but a used up piece of toothpaste, a broken cup. All these images were up with me on the PowerPoint, and they captured something. I learned a lot about communication, that the visual images worked in that way. So when I was doing this, actually when I was doing the first book on complaint, which is more of an academic monograph, complaint exclamation point, which is another thing that I'm really interested in, is punctuation and exclamation points. If you use them too much, they cease to function as exclamations, which is really interesting to me. But the exclamation point in the book Complaint captures something about the intensity of the work. But when I was writing that book, I began sharing this idea that the complaint procedure is often represented as a flowchart, straight lines, clear lines, arrows. It all looks very straightforward. And I began to think of that representation of the complaints procedure as the institution story of complaint. It's what's supposed to happen. It isn't what happens. And for the complainer, I began to think, what would a complaint look like from the complainer's point of view? And I actually was sitting at my desk, not the one I'm sitting at now, but the one next to me. And I just started drawing it. This mess of lines. I'm like, this is what a complaint looks like. And then I thought, why didn't I try that? See how people respond to that. And I used that on a PowerPoint, and people are like, yeah. And then I was looking at that mess of lines, and I was thinking, that can be a picture of a complaint. If you're making a complaint and you're in a precarious situation, I'm thinking of the people who talk to me who are international students, for example. One student made a complaint while her visa was running out. And when her complaint took too long, because often complaints take longer than they're supposed to in accordance with procedures, everything in her life began to unravel. She no longer knew whether she could stay or not, whether she could have residence or not. And so it's not just the complaint that's messy, it's your life that's messy. So I have in this book a picture of these messy lines as a picture of a complaint and a picture of life, and then coming back to it as a queer map. Because all those lines can be like the places that you had to go. Maybe you had to speak to someone in human resources. Maybe you had to speak to someone in occupational health. Maybe you spoke to your head department. Maybe you spoke to a colleague, another administrator. There's so many different conversations that you have to have, and you're often talking to people who aren't talking to each other. Each line could be one of those conversations, one of the conversations that you had to have. But so what then if we think of each line? Okay, it's labor. and the work can be heavy and slow, but each line is also a lead. It's how you find out stuff, how you might find out about complaints that happened before. And I actually began to think about queer maps that tell us where to go to find queer people. We know what queer maps are for, but they can also be ways of doing history, telling us about our comings and goings. So all those conversations that you had to have, they might have taken time, they might take energy. You might think of it as draining, paining, if that's a word, it should be. And then, but then it's also like how you find other people. And
Yep.
and that for me was my experience of complaint, even though the complaint was not mine, it was the students where I used to work. It was how I connected with those students. They became my complaint collective. So all of that labor, that mess, is also a lead. How we get led to others who also said no to the institution, no to the world that they're in, that had made decisions about them or conveyed decisions to them that were unsustainable or unlivable. And it kind of really helped me to think then of that mess as not just about what gets taken from us, but what we acquire, what we are given, what the labor gives us in terms of solidarity or the clarification of the point or the politics of doing that work.
Yeah, it's just such a striking thing, and it's making me think. This is like maybe a nice transition into asking you about your writing practice, but the idea of you've said a few times, like kind of in doing a kind of talk or like a public lecture or something, that like something that happened in that room then fed back into the writing, right? Like this real, not just like
Mm.
not like a testing of ideas, but almost like, oh, that had resonance. How can I like use that now in the writing, or how can I bring that sentence in that was spoken but now it's like written? And I think that's such like an interesting part of the writing practice that maybe people don't talk about. But I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about like how you write. I love asking this question to writers because everyone gives me very different responses. Like if you have a writing practice, if you've always had the same one, do you sit at the same desk? Are you typing? Is there coffee or chocolate, or like what is
Yeah,
your
yeah.
setup?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good question. I also really like talking about the practice of writing, like actually what you do. Um,
Mm.
and writing for me is, this is funny from point of view of being a killjoy, is quite unquote a happy place. It's like having the time and the space to do my writing is really, really important to me. And I'm actually a very, very structured person and I like routine. So I always tend to write pretty much the same time in the mornings. I always have coffee at the beginning. I'm always on the same table, desk with a PC, with a big keyboard. I always look out the same window, well, ever since I've lived here, which has been quite a while now. So I'm sort of, when I'm pondering and thinking, I'm kind of looking at the same tree over there, which has become a very
Mm.
familiar, loved thing in my horizon. And so there is something about like having a lot of routine and the rhythm of the writing and having kind of like things be the same around me. But for me, like writing and speaking, they are on a continuum. And when I wrote queer phenomenology, for some reason, I think it's to do with the table, noticing tables.
Mm.
It was really about beginning to think about what's in the work, the materials, how we put together our arguments. So I'm really fascinated by examples, like how do people exemplify or illustrate their arguments, and that can be true in fiction and nonfiction. Like, what are the things that are in the work itself, and what histories do they have? So, for some reason, when I was starting to get obsessed with tables, has become a lifelong obsession since. I spoke that book. I spoke about tables into a tape recorder. I still got the tape, actually. I haven't listened to it for a long time. Uh, and because before queer phonology, I don't think I really thought about myself as being a writer in the same way. I think I was a researcher, and I was really interested in concepts and words and making sense of the world. I was really interested in that. Actually, making sense, I suppose, would be how I would describe
Mm.
it. It was queer phonology that made me think much more of myself as actually being a writer. And interestingly, that was from speaking. It's from speaking the words, and I think that really made me very aware of sound, how the sentence sound, the sound of a sentence really matters to me. And so whenever I write something, I also speak it. So I will practice my lectures a lot, but I'm not, I will to myself, like I read them out loud, like and I can hear things and notice things from speaking it even to myself. And then when I'm speaking the work to audiences, and I can hear, it's not that you hear it land necessarily, but it's partly just about volume, just sound and reactions, and actually being in audiences and listening to audiences. And when there is a sort of a sound of recognition, has always mattered to me and to the development of my argument. The idea of feminist ears, for
Yep.
instance, came from being at a screening of the feminist film A Question of Silence at the London Film Festival in Hackney, and I heard this audience go. I was part of this audience that just was this roar of recognition at this one scene where a secretary who's at a table makes a point, a really good point. Silence, no one responds, and then the man next to her makes the same point, and everyone goes, "What a great point!" And people could hear how sexism worked, and we heard it together. And in hearing it together, there was this roar of recognition. And that's when I first thought of feminist ears, was like, actually, you know what? We're louder when we hear together, not just when we're heard together. So actually, for me, like writing is a kind of it is all about communication, finding words and the forms to express something that is very difficult to express, and sending it out. So that's why I think of speaking and writing and sound as being very much part of the same project.
Yeah, and when a writer sounds, when you can hear the writer in the work, like I always valued that, right? Like, there are some people, I guess, or maybe in academic training anyway, it's like trying to remove yourself, right? Try and be distant or objective or some kind of nonsensical idea, right? Of just like removing any someone's view versus hearing the person in the work and how they've come to the ideas too, right? As you say, showing your workings or describing
Yeah.
the trail of how you got there, which I think is so valuable, right? I always read someone's like acknowledgements or a preface, right? Because I feel like that's the only place where they say, by the way, this is where the book came from, right? Like I had this conversation with this person, or like I had this little idea. So I think that's really fascinating. And as a morning writer, like I don't feel the same. I can't write in the morning. My brain doesn't work.
All right,
I'm like a
yeah.
morning reader. I think
Yeah.
like in the morning, I want to absorb other people, and then as the day progresses, I can maybe put some words down.
Uh-huh.
Um,
Yeah. Start off with all these start off with lots of, like, energy and
yeah.
clarity, and then gradually things I just it's just things slow down. In the afternoon, I will tend to, I mean, I might still do a bit of editing. I love editing. I love
Okay.
going over chapters and
Wow.
sentences. It's probably my favorite part. I still find the first, like, the beginning of a piece painful, just because the first words, it's hard to get them out, and I sometimes will even put off, like, I'll do something else rather than get the first words out. But once I have the word, just some words, even like a paragraph, I'm just like, "Oh, I can go back to it." And I can start by just
Mm,
working it over and working it over, and I love that. I often think about it as a little bit like just moving the furniture around in a room. You just have to move that chair just that little bit over one way, or that table just a little bit, and the whole room feels different. And I love that. I love the way in which you can kind of rearrange the furniture by moving words around. And yeah, so but I really love editing. It's something that I probably should say more. I think the editing process, like just staying with the words and just working it over and working it over and working it over, giving it time. I suppose it takes time to do that. And I change fonts a lot. I have a
mm,
favorite font, but I change fonts a lot. So if I feel a bit like, if I'm beginning to get a bit, I don't know, not sure or unclear, something's unclear to me what I'm actually trying to say, I will typically just change the font so it just looks different and it comes at you differently, and that really helps.
mm.
And sometimes I go between double spacing and single spacing. It has a similar role in my
Yeah.
enabling me to see something a little bit differently.
Just seeing it differently. Yeah. I recommend that to students all the time, and I never know if they take me up on it. But it seems so sensible. Although, so are you editing on screen, or do you ever print out and kind of scribble on it?
On screen, definitely on
Okay.
screen. Yeah.
Interesting.
And if I'm writing a new
Um,
chapter, like I'm at the moment, I'm writing a book on common sense, and I've just gone into the second part of the book, which is more on, it's on the work of the sociologist Harold Garfinkel a little bit, and ethnomethodology, and the chapter's got very boring title, society. So I've just begun working on that, but I keep finding that I'm actually on the introduction and I'm on the first part of the book because I've been working over that. So it takes me a while to shift my attention to a new piece, and I've learned to give myself a little bit of time, like let myself go back to the what I was doing before. I do find like quite hard shifting from one piece of writing to another. Like I want to keep going back to the one I was doing before. So I sort of like I take a little bit of time before I move my attention, and then I'm on that piece, and then the same thing happens the next time, the next chapter or the next project.
Yeah, but that kind of back and forth is so emblematic of your writing, right? You can almost see that on the page, this kind of like returning to those older ideas and then bringing them forward again. So that definitely makes sense. You also said you have a favorite font. I know this is not the most important question, but what is your favorite font?
Well, it used to be Garamond, but now it's Kandara.
Okay, these are the things that are important to me in life.
And sometimes I make it really small, like the whole document, and sometimes I make it really big. I mean, I have no idea
Yeah.
what that's about. But at the moment, yeah, I've shifted a little bit to Kandara, and I keep I'm actually thinking like maybe I need a new font, but no. And I often go through them and I try the fonts, and they'll last for like 10
Yeah.
minutes, and then I'll go back to the one that
Right.
I
But no, but like it makes sense. Like if you're staring at something like all day, every day, right? Like it needs to do something in your brain and your eye. No, I'm always interested in that. I ask people about what pens they use and all the rest of it. So,
I don't
my
write
final question.
write down very much, and I get really sore hands as well if I'm writing too much, which is interesting. But I used to write. I've got lots of this is it from the Common Sense books. There are lots of these sort of notebooks from my older projects. I used to do all handwritten notes, really close notes from text. But now because so many of the older books you can are PDF'd and you
Yeah,
can cut and paste
yeah,
it. All of my document, all my kind of like archive for my Common Sense project is virtual. I don't really have. I've got some notes, but it doesn't really make sense to write things out by hand and then to type them out. And also, I'm really good at introducing mistakes. It's really good. I'm so good at mistakes. I'm terrible at mistakes, but it's almost good at mistakes because I'm so terrible at them. I kind of like so I've actually gone almost entirely virtual, nothing handwritten hardly at all, which is a bit of a shame because I do think like handwriting, like it's really a way of getting things into your brain in a certain kind of way. But I did know because I did break my wrist in August, so I was finding it very hard to type. And so I did try doing some audio recording, like it's just using the basic program that you can use on your Word document. But I realized that actually I think with my hands, and maybe we all do, I'm so used to writing it down using my keyboard that I couldn't do it. I couldn't actually
yeah,
speak. I mean, I could do a letter like that, a letter to a colleague, but I couldn't do the actual writing that I do that way. So I think we do get very used to sort of thinking with our hands and thinking with the tools and technologies that we use. They're really part of how we think. So
yeah.
yeah,
It's so yeah. There's a somatic thing. It's again the habituation, right? The way that we think and the way that those things are
yeah.
connected. I don't know. All this is fascinating to me. Okay, let me ask you finally. I think I know what you might recommend, but like I want to know what books you will recommend to listeners, what they should go get immediately.
Yeah, I was very lucky to be a teacher at a university for pretty much I think it was 22 or 23 years before I left, and I always taught with Audre Lorde every year, and she is my recommendation for the work that she has done, the poetry as well as the nonfiction. And when I first read Lorde, it helped me to realize that theory can do more when it's closer to the skin. The way she writes from her own experience, the way she's always willing to name herself, to identify herself, to give names to problems, to give problems their names. I mean, it really was revolutionary for me finding Lord. So if you, probably many of you who are listening know Lord well, I find that if you go and reread Lord, any text, Burst of Light, Cancer Journal, Sister Outsider, Black Unicorn, whichever text, you read it tonight. Let's say you read it tonight. You'll hear something different in it. You'll find something different in it. It's kind of like Lord is my companion, especially when it's a very hostile environment right now for many of us, and people are finding it really, really hard to get by and to make do. So work like Lord's is a lifeline. It helps to pull us out of difficult experiences. So that would be my lifelong recommendation.
Wonderful recommendation is too. And yeah, I agree massively. Sara, thank you so much for your time. I really
Thank you.
appreciate you as ever, and I appreciate your brain for all it's done in my brain. So,
Oh, we think together. That's the beautiful thing. We think together and we write together and we read together, and that's what close reading is also about, I guess.
yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for listening to this episode. Please subscribe if you haven't already, leave a review on Apple Podcasts or on YouTube, and share with people on socials. Follow the show and me on Instagram at BooksUpClose. Tag me in any posts of the episodes that you like. And if you can, please do fill out the feedback form that is linked in the show notes. I'll send you some Books Up Close merch if you do, and then send me a message. You can also get show transcripts and more information by subscribing to the Substack. This show is made possible by an Impact Accelerator Award from the University of Hertfordshire and the Arts and Humanities Research Council.